Serene Auvray had rehearsed this moment 47 times. She'd practiced in the mirror. She'd practiced in the corridor. She'd practiced whispering the words to her own reflection in the back of a spoon because the mirror in her chambers had cracked 3 weeks ago and no one had come to replace it. No one ever came. That was the point. She stood now in the great hall of Arendelle, the dissolution papers rolled tight in her fist, and every line she'd rehearsed evaporated like mist off a river. Because King Theron Valdris was looking at her. Not through her. Not past her. Not at the space 2 inches above her left shoulder, the way he had for the entirety of their 11-month marriage. He was looking at her. Directly. Fully. And something in his expression was cracking open in a way she had never seen before. The great hall was vast and cold and built to make people feel small. It succeeded. Banners bearing the Valdris crest, a silver wolf mid-howl against a black field, hung from iron beams 40 feet overhead. Stone columns rose like the ribs of some ancient beast, and the light that filtered through the stained glass fell in colored shards across the floor. Beautiful and indifferent in a way that perfectly captured this castle. 12 council members sat along a curved stone table, their discussions stuttering to silence one by one as they registered the herbalist queen standing uninvited in the doorway. She wasn't supposed to be here. Queens didn't interrupt council sessions. Then again, queens were supposed to be visible enough to have rules to break. Seren walked forward. Her boots echoed against the flagstones. Each step felt like it belonged to someone braver than her, someone who hadn't spent nearly a year haunting the edges of her own marriage like a ghost with a title. She could feel every eye in the room tracking her, could feel the weight of their judgment settling on her shoulders like stones dropped one by one. She reached the table, set the papers down in front of him. "I'm requesting a formal dissolution of our union," she said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that. Theron didn't move. His dark eyes dropped to the papers, then lifted back to her face. The hall had gone deathly quiet. She could hear the wind pushing against the stained glass behind him, could hear the creak of leather as Dristan, his beta, shifted uncomfortably in his chair to the king's right. "You heard me," Seren added, because the silence was unbearable. Still nothing. Then his nostrils flared. It was subtle. A slight widening, a fractional inhale that lasted a beat too long. His pupils blew wide, the dark swallowing the gray until his eyes were nearly black. The color drained from his face so fast that for one absurd second, Seren thought he might faint. The Alpha King of Arendelle. Faint. His chair scraped back. He stood, and the sheer height of him hit her the way it always did, a wall of a man, broad and towering and built like the wars that had made him. But his hands were trembling. She had never seen his hands tremble. "Everyone out," he said. The words were low, raw, stripped of every layer of authority she'd ever heard him wield. This wasn't a command. It was desperation wearing the shape of one. No one moved. "Now." The word cracked like a whip. Chairs scraped. Robes rustled. 12 council members filed out with the hurried compliance of men who'd learned not to test that tone. Dristan lingered at the door, his gaze flicking between the king and Seren, before Theron's glare sent him through it. The heavy oak doors closed with a sound like a coffin lid. They were alone. Seren's pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He was supposed to glance at the papers, nod once, and let her leave. He wasn't supposed to look like the ground had just opened beneath his feet. "Sign them," she whispered. Theron moved around the table, not toward the papers, toward her. Each step was measured, deliberate, like he was approaching something that might bolt. She held her ground, but her heart was slamming so hard against her ribs she could feel it in her teeth. He stopped 2 feet away, close enough that his scent hit her, cedar and iron and something darker beneath it that she'd never been close enough to identify. His hand rose slowly, hovered in the air between them, and then drifted downward. Not toward her hand. Not toward the papers. Toward her stomach. He didn't touch her. His palm hung there, trembling, an inch from the fabric of her dress, and the look on his face was something she couldn't name. Terror. Reverence. A grief so sharp it looked like it was carving him open from the inside. "You can't leave," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Not now." Seren stared at him. "Why?" His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time in their entire marriage, she saw fear. "Because you're carrying my heir." The ground tilted beneath her feet. "That's not possible," she breathed. But his hand was still hovering over her stomach, and his face was still breaking apart, and somewhere deep in her chest, in a place she didn't have a name for, something stirred. Something that already knew he was right. 11 months earlier, Seren had arrived at Arindale in a borrowed dress with exactly one trunk to her name. The Avre pack had been dying for years, tucked into the frost-bitten edge of the Grey March borderlands. They were too small to defend themselves, and too proud to beg. When the Valdris crown offered a treaty sealed by marriage, Seren's father hadn't hesitated. "You'll be queen," he'd told her, as though that was supposed to mean something to a girl who'd grown up mending fishing nets and mixing salves from wild herbs she gathered in the hills. "I'll be currency," Seren had replied. Her father hadn't argued. The wedding had been efficient. That was the kindest word she could find for it. A ceremony in the great hall, attended by nobles who looked at her the way one looks at a stray animal someone has inexplicably brought indoors. Theron had spoken his vows in a low, clipped tone, his gaze fixed somewhere over her head. He'd placed the bonding ring on her finger with the mechanical precision of a man completing a task on his schedule. When the officiant had said he could kiss his bride, Theron had leaned down and pressed his lips to her forehead. Her forehead. Not her mouth. Not her cheek. Her forehead, like she was a child being put to bed. That single gesture had told her everything she needed to know about her marriage. The first week, she'd tried. She'd dressed carefully each morning, appeared at meals, smiled at courtiers who didn't smile back. She'd gone to the king's study one evening with a pot of tea she'd brewed herself, chamomile and honey, and found the door locked. A guard informed her that His Majesty was not to be disturbed. The second week, she tried harder. She requested a meeting through Drystan, his beta, and was granted 15 minutes between a border patrol briefing and a trade negotiation. Theron had listened to her stumbling attempt at conversation with the distracted patience of a man enduring a mild inconvenience. When she'd asked if there was anything she could do, any role she could fill, any purpose she could serve in his court, he'd said, "You have everything you need. Is that not sufficient?" Not once had he called her by name. By the third week, she'd stopped trying. The months that followed taught Seren a particular kind of loneliness, the kind that lived in beautiful rooms. Her chambers were large and well-furnished. Her meals arrived on time. Servants addressed her as "Your Majesty," with practiced blankness, the way one addresses a portrait hanging on a wall. She was fed, housed, titled, and absolutely invisible. Theron was a ghost she shared a castle with. She saw him at formal dinners where he sat at the head of the table and she sat 7 seats away. She saw him crossing the courtyard with his war council, his stride long and purposeful, his face set in the expression of a man who carried the weight of an entire kingdom on his shoulders and intended to carry it alone. He never looked her way. She learned to read the architecture of his absence, the study door that was always locked by the time she walked past it, the wing of the castle where his private chambers sat, which she had never entered and never been invited to. The way servants would glance at her with something between pity and discomfort, as though they understood the shape of her marriage better than she did and wished they didn't. Once, in the 3rd month, she'd crossed paths with him in a corridor. They'd been alone. No counsel, no guards, no audience. She'd opened her mouth to say something, anything, even just good morning, and he had looked directly at her for one searing, unguarded second. Something had moved behind his eyes, something fierce and raw and almost painful. Then the mask had come down, and he'd walked past her without a word. She'd stood in the empty corridor for a full minute afterward, her pulse hammering, trying to make sense of what she'd seen. Had she imagined it? Had she projected her own loneliness onto a man who felt nothing? By the 4th month, she'd stopped asking. She filled her days in the only way she knew how, with her hands in the dirt. The castle's herb garden had been neglected for years, a tangled mess of dead stems and invasive weeds choking out anything useful. Seren claimed it without asking permission. No one objected. No one noticed. She spent her mornings on her knees in the soil, coaxing life back into beds of lavender and feverfew and wild sage. She spent her afternoons in the infirmary, where the court physician, a sharp-tongued woman named Irina, had taken one look at Seren's herb-stained hands and said, "Well, at least someone in this castle is useful." Irina became her only real companion. The older woman had a talent for brutal honesty delivered with surgical calm, and she didn't treat Seren like a decoration. "He's not cruel, you know," Irina said one afternoon, watching Seren grind dried valerian root with more force than was strictly necessary. "I didn't say he was." "You're thinking it." Seren set the mortar down. "I'm thinking I could disappear tomorrow and it would take him a week to notice, if he noticed at all." Irina was quiet for a moment. "There are different kinds of cruelty," she said. "Neglect is one of them." The truth settled over Seren like a cold cloth. She was not mistreated. She was not abused. She was simply irrelevant. And irrelevance, she discovered, was its own slow poison. The decision to leave crystallized on a Tuesday. Nothing dramatic happened. No final straw, no confrontation, no revelation. She simply woke up, looked at the ceiling of her beautiful, empty chamber and thought, "I cannot do this for the rest of my life." She'd spent the next 2 weeks quietly drafting dissolution papers. The law was clear. A bonded union without a completed mating bite could be formally dissolved by petition of either party. Their marriage was legal, but unconsummated. No bite had been exchanged. No bond had been formed. She was, in the eyes of shifter law, a wife in name only, which meant she could leave. She told Irina on the morning she planned to deliver the papers. "You're certain?" Irina asked, her expression unreadable. "I'm certain I can't stay." Irina studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. "Then do it cleanly. Don't give him room to negotiate." Seren had taken a breath, picked up the papers, and walked to the great hall. She hadn't expected him to look at her like that. She hadn't expected him to stand so fast the chair scraped stone. She hadn't expected the raw, splintering terror in his eyes when his hand hovered over her stomach. And she certainly hadn't expected the words that followed. "Because you're carrying my heir." Standing alone in the great hall after the doors had closed, after the council had fled, after the air had gone thick with something she couldn't name, Seren pressed her hand flat against her own stomach and felt nothing. No flutter, no warmth, no mystical awareness. "You're lying," she said. Theron's jaw tightened. "I have never lied to you." "You've never spoken to me," she shot back. And the words came out sharper than she intended, edged with 11 months of silence. "You don't get to start now with something like this." His hand dropped to his side. The trembling had stopped, replaced by something rigid and controlled, the mask sliding back into place. But his eyes hadn't caught up with the rest of him. They were still wide, still fractured, still looking at her like she'd just pulled the ground out from under his feet. "Drystan," he called. The doors opened instantly, which meant the beta had been listening. "Summon Irina," Theron said, not breaking eye contact with Seren. Now. Seren's stomach dropped. Why? Because you don't believe me, he said quietly. And you need to. Irina arrived in under 10 minutes, which meant she'd been expecting the summons. The look she gave Seren when she entered the great hall was careful, measured, and entirely too knowing. Sit down, Irina said, not to the king, to Seren. I'm fine standing. You won't be in a moment, sit. Seren sat, not because she was obedient, but because her legs had been threatening to give out for the last 10 minutes, and pride could only carry a person so far. Irina knelt beside her, took her wrist, and closed her eyes. Her fingers pressed against the pulse point, steady and sure, and for a long, horrible moment, the only sound in the great hall was the wind against the windows and Seren's own breathing. Then Irina opened her eyes. 6 weeks, she said, her voice neutral. Perhaps 7. The floor tilted. Seren gripped the edge of the chair. That's not possible, she said, and she heard her own voice like it belonged to someone else, thin and far away. He never. But even as the words left her mouth, the memory surfaced. One night. One single night, roughly 8 weeks ago, when a storm had knocked out the power to the east wing, and she'd gone to check that the herb stores hadn't flooded. She'd found Theron in the corridor outside the storeroom, soaked, his eyes wild, his breathing ragged. Something had been wrong with him, deeply wrong, and he'd looked at her like he was drowning and she was the only solid thing left in the world. She'd reached for him. He'd pulled her in. It had happened fast, urgent, and overwhelming. In the storeroom, his hands shaking, her breath caught in her throat, both of them acting on something primal that bypassed thought entirely. He'd whispered her name against her hair. Her name. The only time he'd ever said it. Afterward, he'd pulled away like he'd been burned. He'd left without a word, and by morning, it was as though it had never happened. He didn't look at her, didn't reference it. The silence that followed was so complete that Seren had genuinely wondered if she'd dreamed it. She hadn't dreamed it. The memory hit her with physical force, and she gripped the armrest of the chair to keep from swaying. She could still feel how tightly he'd held her, could still hear the sound he'd made when he pressed his forehead against hers, like a man surfacing from deep water. Could still remember the way his hands had cupped her face afterward, trembling, his eyes wide and horrified, as though he'd just done something unforgivable. And then, he was gone. Down the corridor, away from her, and the cold rushed in to fill the space where his body had been. She'd waited 3 days for him to say something, to acknowledge what had happened, to look at her across the dining hall with even a flicker of recognition. Nothing. The silence had been so absolute, so deliberate, that Seren had eventually convinced herself she'd imagined the entire encounter. That she'd fabricated the memory of that night because the loneliness had finally cracked something inside her. She hadn't fabricated anything. 6 weeks, Seren repeated numbly. Irina stood and turned to the king. You knew before I confirmed it, she said. It wasn't a question. Theron stood by the window, his arms crossed, his back rigid. I caught the scent change 3 days ago. 3 days. The number landed like a slap. He'd known for 3 days that she was carrying his child, and he'd said nothing. Done nothing. Let her walk into the great hall with dissolution papers in her hand while he sat there knowing. 3 days, Seren said, and now her voice wasn't thin anymore. It was sharp, edged, building towards something hot. You've known for 3 days and you didn't tell me? I was going to. When? She stood, the chair scraping back. When were you going to tell me? Before or after I spent another month wondering why my husband can't stand to be in the same room as me? The words hit their mark. She saw it in the way his shoulders tightened, the way his jaw locked down like he was physically holding something back. That isn't what this is, he said. Then what is it? Seren demanded. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you married me because you needed a treaty, ignored me for 11 months, and now you want me to stay because I'm carrying something you actually care about. The pause that followed was devastating. Theron turned from the window. The mask was still in place, that careful, controlled blankness he wore like armor, but beneath it, something was fracturing. She could see it in the set of his mouth, the way the muscle in his jaw jumped, the way his hands stayed locked at his sides like he didn't trust what they'd do if he let go. You will not leave Arendelle, he said. You don't get to decide that. As your king, I do. As my king? Seren repeated, incredulous. You've barely been my husband. Don't you dare pull rank on me now. Something flared in his eyes, hot and dangerous, and for one breathless second the air between them crackled with something that wasn't anger. He took a step toward her, then stopped, forced himself still. The pregnancy changes things, he said, the words strained. There are complications you don't understand. Then explain them. I can't. You won't. He flinched. Actually flinched like she'd struck him, and the sight of it knocked the rage out of her so abruptly she felt dizzy. In 11 months of marriage, she'd never seen him react to anything. He was stone. He was iron. He was the king who'd ended the Ashenmore rebellion through sheer force of will and walked out of the aftermath without a scratch. He did not flinch. Your Majesty, Arena interjected, her voice calm in the way that only a woman who'd been managing difficult men for 30 years could manage. Perhaps this conversation would benefit from less pride and more information. Theron's gaze stayed locked on Seren. The dissolution is denied, he said. You'll remain in the castle. Your quarters will be moved to the east wing, closer to the infirmary and closer to... He stopped. Closer to what? Seren pressed. Closer to me, he said quietly, and the admission seemed to cost him something. Seren stared at him. 11 months of nothing, and now this. Proximity, attention, fear in his eyes, and his hand trembling over her belly like the thing growing inside her was both a miracle and a catastrophe. She wanted to scream. She wanted to cry. She wanted to grab him by the collar and demand to know why he'd wasted nearly a year being absent, when apparently he was capable of looking at her like she was the most terrifying thing he'd ever faced. Instead, she picked up the dissolution papers from the table, held them in front of his face, and tore them in half. Fine, she said. I'll stay, but not because you're ordering me to, and not because of the baby. His brow creased. Then why? Because you owe me answers, she said, and I'm not leaving until I get every single one. She turned and walked out of the great hall before he could respond, her pulse hammering, her hands shaking, and her mind reeling with a single impossible thought. She was pregnant. With the Alpha King's heir. And for reasons she didn't yet understand, that terrified him more than anything else in the world. Behind her, she didn't see Theron sink into his chair and put his head in his hands. She didn't see Drystan step quietly through the side door, take one look at his king, and freeze. She didn't see the way Theron's fingers dug into his own scalp, white-knuckled, like he was physically holding himself together. And she didn't hear what he whispered into the empty hall, his voice wrecked, barely audible even to the beta standing 6 feet away. It's happening again. Drystan closed the door. The hall went dark. The east wing chambers were larger than her old rooms. That was the first thing Seren noticed. The second was that they smelled like him. Not strongly. Not like he'd been sleeping there. More like he'd walked through recently. Lingered. Maybe stood in the doorway before leaving. Cedar and iron and that darker undertone she still couldn't identify. It clung to the curtains and the bedposts, and settled into her lungs before she could decide how she felt about it. These were prepared in advance, she murmured, running her hand along the fresh linens. The sheets were crisp, the pillows plump, and a vase of wild lavender sat on the windowsill, the exact variety she grew in her garden. "At the king's instruction," Dresden confirmed from the doorway. His voice was carefully neutral, the way it always was, but his eyes were watchful. "When he first detected the scent change in you." Days of preparation, days of knowing she was carrying his child and saying nothing, while servants moved furniture and stocked shelves and made a space for her that was close enough to hear his footsteps in the corridor. "He's infuriating," Seren said. "Yes," Dryston agreed, without hesitation. She turned to look at him, surprised. The beta was tall and lean, with sharp features and the kind of stillness that suggested he saw far more than he let on. In 11 months, he'd been polite but distant, an extension of his king's indifference. "You know why he's afraid," Seren said. Not a question. Drystan's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. "That's not my place to share." "Whose place is it?" "His. When he's ready." "And if he's never ready?" The beta was quiet for a moment. "Then you'll have to take it from him," he said. "The same way you took those dissolution papers into the Great Hall. By walking straight at the thing everyone else is afraid to touch." He inclined his head and left. Seren stood alone in her new chambers and pressed her palm flat against her belly. Still nothing. No flutter, no warmth, no awareness. She was 6 weeks pregnant with the Alpha King's heir, and the only evidence was a healer's word and the look of absolute devastation on a man's face. She didn't see Theron that evening, or the next morning, or the one after that. What she saw instead were the traces of him. A fire that had been freshly stoked before she arrived each night, the logs arranged with a precision that suggested it hadn't been left to servants. A stack of books that appeared on her bedside table, titles on herbal medicine and advanced botany, subjects she'd mentioned to Irina months ago in conversations she'd assumed no one else was listening to. A woolen blanket draped over the foot of her bed, far thicker and finer than anything in the servant stores, with the faint scent of cedar woven into its fibers. He was orbiting her, not approaching, not speaking, not appearing in any doorway she could confront, but circling at a distance, leaving evidence of his attention like a wolf marking the borders of a territory he couldn't bring himself to enter. The herb garden was the most telling. She'd gone out one morning to find that someone had repaired the broken trellis she'd been meaning to fix for weeks. The posts were sunk deep and level, the crossbars sanded smooth, the work too precise, and too strong to have been done by the garden staff. A guard she'd befriended told her, with the careful neutrality of a man who valued his position, that the king had been seen in the east courtyard before dawn. Before dawn, on his knees in her garden, fixing her trellis, while she slept 3 floors above him. It made her furious. It made her ache. She couldn't decide which feeling was worse. "He's always been like this," Irina told her during a routine examination at the end of the first week. The healer pressed gentle fingers along Seren's abdomen, checking for things Seren didn't understand. "Presence without proximity. It's his particular talent." "It's cowardice," Seren muttered. "Perhaps?" Irina withdrew her hands. "Or perhaps there's a reason he keeps his distance from the people he—" She stopped, considered her words, and redirected. "Everything looks healthy. The child is strong." Seren caught the redirect. "From the people he— What?" "You should rest more," Irina said, ignoring the question entirely. "And eat. You've lost weight you shouldn't have lost." That night, Seren lay in her new bed in her new chambers and stared at the ceiling. The fire crackled. The blanket that smelled like him was pulled up to her chin because the east wing was colder than her old rooms, and she was practical, not sentimental, and the scent meant nothing. She was almost asleep when she heard it. Footsteps in the corridor. Heavy, measured, unmistakable. They approached her door and stopped. Seren held her breath. The fire popped. A log shifted. The footsteps didn't continue. He was standing on the other side of her door, close enough that she could hear the faint rhythm of his breathing if she held absolutely still. She wanted to get up, wanted to wrench the door open and demand the answers he owed her. But something in the quality of his breathing stopped her. It was unsteady, ragged at the edges, and there was a sound beneath it, low and strained, like a man trying very hard not to fall apart. Then she heard something else, a soft thud, like a forehead resting against wood. He was leaning against her door. Seren pressed her hand against the oak. Her fingertips splayed across the grain, and wondered if his hand was mirrored on the other side. Wondered if there was only 2 inches of wood and 11 months of silence between his skin and hers. On the other side, she heard him exhale, long and shuddering, like he'd felt it. Like the door wasn't thick enough to stop whatever was pulling between them. Minutes passed. 5, 10. His breathing steadied, slowed, grew almost peaceful, which made no sense because he was standing in a corridor in the middle of the night like a man who couldn't be in the same room as her, but couldn't bring himself to leave. Then the footsteps retreated. Slow, reluctant, growing quieter until the corridor swallowed them whole. Seren stayed with her hand on the door long after the silence returned. "What are you so afraid of?" she whispered. The next morning, she found Irina before the sun was fully up. The healer was already at her workbench, sorting dried bloodroot with the efficient calm of a woman who treated 5 a.m. like a reasonable hour. "I need to know what's wrong with him," Seren said without preamble. Irina didn't look up. "Good morning to you too." "Irina, please." Something in her tone made the healer pause. She set down the bloodroot and turned, studying Seren with that penetrating gaze that always made her feel like her skin was made of glass. "What makes you think something is wrong with him?" Irina asked. "He stands outside my door at night. He doesn't come in. He doesn't knock. He just stands there and breathes like he's in pain, and then he leaves." Irina's hands went still. "How long?" the healer asked. "Every night this week?" The silence that followed felt different from the usual pauses in Irina's speech. Heavier, loaded with something that looked a lot like worry. "There's something you need to understand about the Valdris bloodline," Irina said slowly. "Something the court doesn't speak about. Something the king has forbidden anyone to discuss." Seren's pulse quickened. "Tell me." Irina glanced at the door, then back at Seren. "Not here," she said, "and not all of it, not yet." "Why not?" "Because some of it isn't mine to tell." Irina held up a hand before Seren could protest. "But I'll tell you this much, and you need to hear it carefully." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Every Valdris Alpha for 4 generations has lost control of their wolf before the age of 40. Theron's grandfather went feral at 36. His father at 32. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. "Theron is 31, Irina continued quietly, "and he's been fighting it for over a year." The room went cold. "That's why he keeps his distance," Seren whispered. "That's why he keeps his distance from you specifically," Irina corrected. "You're the one person in this castle he's terrified of hurting." Seren's hand moved to her abdomen without thinking. "And the baby?" she asked, barely audible. Irina's expression shifted. Not pity. Something worse. Something that looked like genuine fear. "That's the part I can't tell you," the healer said. "That's the part you need to hear from him." Seren found him in the armory. It was the last place she'd expected, though perhaps it shouldn't have been. The room was deep in the castle's lower levels, cold and windowless, lit by a single row of oil lamps that cast more shadow than light. Weapons lined the walls, blades and polearms and things she didn't have names for. And in the center of the room, Theron stood shirtless, driving his fist into a leather training post with a rhythm that spoke of hours, not minutes. His knuckles were raw and bruised. Sweat glistened on the leather. "We need to talk," Seren said from the doorway. He didn't stop. Another strike, precise and brutal, the impact echoing off the stone. Then another. "I know about the bloodline," she said. He stopped. The stillness that followed was so thick, she could feel it pressing against her skin. Theron stood with his back to her, his shoulders rising and falling with controlled breaths, and she watched the muscles in his back tense like he was bracing for impact. "Irina," he said. "Not a question. She told me enough. Your grandfather. Your father. What happens to Valdris Alphas?" Seren stepped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. "Now I need to hear the rest. About the baby." He turned slowly. In the dim lamplight, the damage was worse than she'd thought. Not just the knuckles. His face was gaunt, the hollows beneath his eyes deeper than they'd been a week ago. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days, which, she realized with a sickening lurch, he probably hadn't. Without her near him, without whatever effect her presence had, he was deteriorating. An heir conceived without a completed bond is unprotected, Theron said, his voice flat, clinical, like he was reading from a medical text instead of discussing their child. The father's energy imprints on the child during gestation. If the father's wolf is stable, the imprint is harmless. "And if it isn't stable," Seren whispered. His jaw worked. "The corruption passes through. The child's wolf develops already compromised, already halfway to feral before it ever takes its first breath." The room tilted. Seren reached for the wall. "That's why you're afraid," she said, the pieces snapping together with horrible clarity. "It's not just that you might go feral. It's that you might take the baby with you." Something shattered behind his eyes. The clinical mask crumbled, and what was beneath it was so raw, so exposed, that Seren felt her own chest crack in response. "My father held me when I was born," Theron said quietly. "He loved me. He was a good man. He taught me to ride. He taught me to fight. He used to sit with me in the evenings and tell me stories about the old kings, about honor and sacrifice, and what it meant to protect the people who depended on you." His voice fractured. "And the day he went feral, he looked at me and didn't recognize his own son. He looked at me the way he looked at enemies. I called his name, and nothing came back. Nothing. Just teeth and rage and a sound no human throat should make." He paused, his breathing ragged. "I put him down, Seren. I was 23 years old, and I had to end my own father because the thing wearing his body was trying to destroy everyone in the throne room. My mother had already died of grief 6 months earlier, waiting for the same thing she'd always known was coming, and I stood over him and made myself a promise." "What promise?" Seren whispered. "That I would never do that to someone I loved, that I would never let anyone get close enough to have to watch it happen, and that when my time came, I would handle it alone." The words hung in the air between them, heavy, irreversible. "And now you think you'll become him," Seren said softly. "I know I will." He said it with the certainty of a man stating the color of the sky. "It's not a question of if, it's when. Every Valdris Alpha falls, every single one." Seren crossed the room. She stopped directly in front of him, near enough to feel the heat radiating off his skin, near enough to see the pulse hammering in his throat. "Then why did you marry me?" she asked. "If you knew what was coming, why bring me into this?" Shame flooded his expression. "The treaty. Your pack was dying. My council said the alliance would stabilize the borderlands, and I thought—" He closed his eyes. "I thought I could keep you safe by keeping you at arm's length. That if I never touched you, never bonded you, never let you close enough to matter, then when I fell, you'd walk away clean." The confession hit her like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel, but because it was the opposite. Every cold silence, every averted gaze, every night he'd locked his study door while she stood on the other side, wondering what she'd done wrong. It wasn't indifference. It was the most brutal form of love she'd ever encountered. "You idiot," she breathed, and her voice cracked on the word. His eyes opened. She saw surprise in them, and beneath it, something so desperately hopeful it made her want to weep. "You kept me at arm's length to protect me," she said, "and instead you made me believe I was worthless, that I was nothing to you. Do you understand what that did?" He flinched. "Nearly a year," she said, her voice rising. "Nearly a year of being invisible, of eating alone, of tending a garden no one cared about in a castle where no one knew my name. I thought you despised me." "I have never—" "I know that now," she cut in. "But you should have told me. You should have trusted me enough to tell me. I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself," she said, and the truth of it landed between them like a stone. Theron went very still. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "I was terrified. Not just of hurting you, of letting you in and then losing everything, of watching you look at me the way I looked at my father at the end." Seren reached up and pressed her palm against his cheek. He leaned into her touch so immediately, so instinctively, that it stole her breath. His eyes closed and a sound escaped him, low and broken and full of so much need it made her heart ache. "The night in the storeroom," she said softly. "That wasn't an accident, was it?" His hand came up to cover hers. "My wolf broke through. It scented you and I couldn't. I tried to stay away. I tried every single day to stay away from you. And that night the storm came, and I could smell you in the corridor, and I just—" He stopped. His breathing had changed, grown rough, uneven. His hand was trembling against hers again, and when his eyes opened, Seren's blood went cold. His irises were flickering. Gray to gold to gray again, like a light stuttering between two frequencies. The gold wasn't his. It was wilder, hungrier, something ancient and barely contained pressing against the surface. "Theron," she whispered. "Step back," he gritted out. His hand dropped from hers. His whole body had gone rigid, every muscle locked down, and she could see the cords in his neck standing out like ropes. "Seren, step back, now." She didn't move. "Step back." The last word came out distorted, layered with a growl that vibrated through the stone floor beneath her feet. His canines were elongating, his spine curved, and she heard the terrible sound of bones shifting beneath skin. Seren stumbled backward, her heart hammering, and watched the man she was only just beginning to understand fight a war against his own body. His fists drove into the training post, once, twice, 3 times, each strike harder than the last, and the sound he made wasn't a groan. It was a howl of anguish compressed into a human throat. Then it passed. His shoulders dropped, his breathing steadied. When he lifted his head, his eyes were gray again, but he looked hollowed out, emptied. "Now you see," he said, his voice wrecked. "Theron. Take the child and leave Arindale." The words came out mechanically, like he'd rehearsed them 1,000 times. "Go back to Greymarch. Go anywhere. Just go before I become the thing that destroys you both." Seren stared at him. He turned his back to her, and the dismissal was absolute. She left the armory with her hands pressed against her belly, tears streaming down her face, and the devastating understanding that the man she'd married wasn't cold, wasn't cruel, wasn't indifferent. He was dying. And he was trying to die alone. Seren did not leave Arindale. She went to Irina's workroom, sat down on the bench beside the herb stores, and refused to move until the healer told her everything. "Everything," Seren repeated when Irina hesitated. "No more half-truths. No more, That's not mine to tell. I just watched his eyes turn gold and his bones start to shift. I'm carrying his child, and he just ordered me to flee the kingdom. So you are going to sit down and tell me everything, or I swear on every herb in this room I will make your life extraordinarily difficult. Irina sat down. The feral degeneration is real, the healer began. Every Valdris alpha in recorded history has succumbed. The wolf overtakes the man, and what remains is something that cannot be reasoned with, cannot be reached, cannot be stopped without lethal force. Is there a cure? There was never a cure, but there is a precedent. Irina paused, her fingers lacing together. 300 years ago, a Valdris alpha named Corvan bonded with a woman from a borderland pack. Unremarkable bloodline, no title, no status. But after the bond was completed, the degeneration stopped. Corvan lived to 64. He died in his sleep with his mate beside him. Seren's breath caught. The bond stopped it? Not any bond. Her specifically. The records describe it as an anchoring effect. Certain wolves carry a stabilizing resonance in their pheromonal signature, something that counteracts the feral drift. It's extraordinarily rare. The word anchoring echoed in Seren's mind. She thought of the night in the storeroom, how Theron's wolf had broken through every wall he had built just to reach her. She thought of the nights he stood outside her door, and his breathing steadied. "You think I have it," Seren said. "This anchoring effect." Irina met her eyes. "I know you do. I've known since the week you arrived." The quiet that followed was absolute. "You knew," Seren repeated, and her voice was dangerously quiet. "You knew when I got here, and you didn't say anything. I couldn't be certain until I observed the effect directly. And I did, the night he came to the storeroom. His wolf breaking through wasn't loss of control, Seren. It was his wolf seeking the only thing that could save it." Seren stood up so abruptly the bench scraped against stone. "Did he know? When he married me, did he know what I was?" "No." Irina's voice was firm. "Theron married you for the treaty. He had no idea about the anchoring effect. He intended to keep you safe by keeping you distant and then release you when the degeneration took him. Then who arranged it? Someone put an Avri wolf in front of a Valdris alpha. That doesn't happen by accident." Irina was quiet for a long moment. "His mother," she said finally. "Queen Iselda. Before she died, she asked me to find a match. Someone with the resonance. Someone who could save her son the way no one could save her husband." Irina's voice softened. "I found you when you were 17, Seren. I've been watching over your pack for years, waiting for the right time." The revelation should have been devastating. Another layer of manipulation, another person treating her as a tool, a commodity, a means to someone else's end, and part of her did feel that familiar, corrosive burn of being used. But a larger part of her felt something else entirely, because Irina's eyes were wet, and the healer was looking at her with an expression Serene had never seen before. Not clinical detachment, not professional concern, guilt, deep personal aching guilt. "I should have told you sooner," Irina whispered. "I should have told you both. But Theron had already decided to keep you at a distance, and I thought if I just gave it time, his wolf would find its way to you naturally, and it did, Seren. That night in the storeroom, it did. But then he pulled away again, and you were so unhappy, and You let me suffer," Seren finished, but there was no venom in it, just exhaustion. "You let us both suffer." "Yes, and I'm sorry." Seren pressed her hands against her eyes. Her head was pounding. The baby, barely 6 weeks formed, felt like it was pulling at something inside her chest, a thread connected to a man 3 corridors away who was trying to destroy himself out of love. "Where is he now?" Seren asked. "His chambers," Drystan said from the doorway. They both turned. The beta stood with his arms crossed, his expression grave. He's locked himself in. Won't eat, won't see anyone. He's been like this since you left the armory. How bad is it? Irina asked sharply. Bad. The episodes are increasing. 3 in the last hour. He's holding, but... Dryston stopped. He won't hold much longer. Siren was already moving. She pushed past Dryston into the corridor, her heart slamming against her ribs, the thread in her chest pulling taut. Siren, wait. Dryston caught her arm. If he's mid-episode, approaching him could be dangerous. His wolf might not recognize. His wolf broke through a year of self-imposed isolation to find me in a storeroom during a storm, Siren said. It knows exactly who I am. She pulled free and ran. The corridor to his chambers had never felt so long. She could hear it before she reached the door, a low, continuous growl that vibrated through the stone walls, more animal than human. 2 guards stood outside, pale-faced, their hands on their weapons. Open the door, Siren commanded. Your Majesty, the king has ordered. Open the door. The guards looked at each other. Then one of them reached for the handle. The room was dark. The fire had been overturned, embers scattered across the stone floor, and the furniture was destroyed. The desk was splintered. The bed frame was cracked. Claw marks scored the walls in long, ragged gouges. Theron crouched in the far corner, his back against the stone, his hands fisted in his own hair. His eyes were pure gold. His breathing came in harsh, shuddering gasps, and the growl that poured from his chest was constant, involuntary, the sound of a man being consumed from the inside. Theron, Siren said softly. The growling stopped. His head lifted, those golden eyes fixed on her, and she saw the moment recognition fought through, a flicker of gray in the gold, urgent and drowning. Get out! He snarled, but his voice broke on the second word. She walked toward him. Siren, please. It was a beg now, ragged and raw. I can't control it. If I hurt you, you won't. She knelt in front of him, so near she could feel the heat pouring off his skin, so near she could see the tears cutting through the grime on his face. You won't hurt me, Theron. Your wolf doesn't want to hurt me. It never did. She took his face in her hands. His skin was burning. His jaw was clenched so tight she could feel the muscles spasming beneath her palms. The gold in his eyes surged, retreated, surged again. I'm not leaving, she told him. Not now. Not ever. And you don't get to decide that for me. You don't understand what I am, he choked out. You're my husband, Siren said. And I'm choosing you. Not because of a treaty. Not because of the baby. Because of you. The man who left books on my nightstand and stoked my fire, and stood outside my door every night because he couldn't bear to be away, but was too afraid to come in. Something shattered in his expression. I'm not worth this, he murmured, barely audible. I spent my entire life believing the same thing about myself, she replied, her voice thick with tears. And I was wrong. So are you. She kissed him. The moment her lips touched his whole body seized. She felt the war inside him through the contact, felt his wolf surge forward and, then, impossibly, still. Not retreating, not attacking. Settling. Like a wild, thrashing thing that had finally found the one place it recognized as safe. His hands came up to cradle her face, trembling violently, and he kissed her back with the desperate hunger of a man who'd been starving for the better part of a year. Siren felt the tears on his cheeks mix with her own. She felt his breathing change, deepen, steady. She felt the gold recede from his eyes like a tide pulling back from shore. Bond with me, she whispered against his mouth. Complete it. Let me anchor you. If I bond with you and still fall, then we fall together. That's what a bond means. He stared at her for one long, suspended moment. Then his mouth found the curve of her neck, and his teeth grazed the skin there, and she felt the question in it, the hesitation, the desperate need for permission. "Yes," she breathed. He placed the bonding mark against her neck. The bond exploded through her like light through shattered glass. She felt him, all of him, not just the king, not just the controlled surface, but the grief beneath it, the terror, the loneliness, the love he'd been drowning in since the day she'd arrived in a borrowed dress with nothing to her name. She gasped, overwhelmed, and marked him back, pressing her own claim against his shoulder, sealing him as hers as fiercely as he'd sealed her as his. The bond locked into place, complete, permanent, unbreakable. Theron collapsed against her, shaking, his face buried in her neck, his arms wrapped around her so tightly she could barely breathe. She held him on the floor of his destroyed room and felt his wolf settle inside him, not cured, not tamed, but anchored, held fast by something stronger than the curse. They stayed like that until his trembling stopped, until his breathing evened, until the gold faded entirely and his eyes were gray again, exhausted and red-rimmed and looking at her like she'd just pulled him back from the edge of an abyss. "I have you," Seren murmured, pressing her forehead to his. "I have you." He carried her to what remained of the bed. They curled together in the wreckage, his body wrapped around hers, her back against his chest, his hand spread protectively over her stomach where their child grew. For the first time in over a year, Theron Valdris slept, and Seren, her hand covering his, her body warm and safe and anchored against the man she'd come to this castle intending to leave, slept beside him. She woke in the dark to the sound of chains. Not real chains, not metal against stone. Something deeper, something felt rather than heard, reverberating through the bond like a heartbeat made of iron. She was standing in a forest that wasn't a forest. The trees were black and leafless, their branches twisted into shapes that hurt to look at. The ground beneath her bare feet was soft and warm in a way that living ground should never be. And ahead of her, in a clearing ringed by dead trees, she saw it. A wolf, massive, magnificent, and chained. Heavy iron links bound its legs, its neck, its jaw. The chains were sunk into the earth itself, pulled taut, and everywhere they touched the wolf's fur, the skin beneath had gone black and rotten. The wolf's eyes were gold, wild with pain and fury, and it was snarling at something Seren couldn't see. Then she heard the voice, low, measured, patient, coming from everywhere and nowhere. "You know what you are, Theron. You know what you'll become. The chains are all that's keeping them safe." And Seren realized with dawning horror that the chains weren't the curse. The chains were Theron's. He'd built them himself. He was the one holding his own wolf down, crushing it, starving it, because he believed the alternative was becoming his father. The curse wasn't making him go feral. His fear of going feral was destroying him from the inside. The wolf saw her before she was ready. Its massive head swung toward her, nostrils flaring, and the snarl that had been directed at the darkness redirected itself at her with full, terrifying force. The chains rattled as it lunged, and Seren stumbled back, her bare feet sliding on the too warm ground. But then it stopped. Mid-lunge, mid-snarl, the wolf froze. Its golden eyes locked onto hers, and something shifted in them. Not recognition exactly, but a question. A raw, animal question that had no words. "I'm here," Seren whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm not afraid of you." That was a lie. She was terrified. But the bond hummed between them, warm and steady, and through it she could feel Theron, the real Theron, somewhere behind the wolf's anguish. Buried, drowning, but there. The voice spoke again, and this time Seren could feel where it came from. Not from the trees, not from the fog. From inside the wolf itself. from a place so deep it predated language. Every Valdris Alpha falls. You watched your father's eyes go empty. You felt him turn on you. You ended him because there was no one else. And now the same rot is in your blood, in your bones, in the child you were fool enough to create. The wolf howled. The sound was devastating, so saturated with grief that Seren felt it in her own chest like a physical wound. Her knees buckled. That's his voice, she realized, horror flooding through her. That's not the curse speaking. That's what Theron tells himself every single day. She forced herself upright, forced herself forward, one step, then another, until she was close enough to see the places where the chains had worn the wolf's fur down to raw, weeping flesh. "You're killing yourself," she said, and she wasn't speaking to the wolf. She was speaking through the bond to the man on the other end of it, the man who had spent over a year wrapping himself in chains of his own making because he believed containment was the same thing as control. The wolf's golden eyes fixed on her. It was panting, shallow and rapid, pain and exhaustion in every breath. "You built these chains," Seren said, kneeling slowly. "You put them on yourself because you thought that was the only way to keep the people around you safe. But they're not holding your wolf back, Theron. They're poisoning it. You're starving your own wolf, and it's going mad because you won't let it breathe." The voice surged, louder now, panicked. "If the chains break, there's nothing between the wolf and the world? Nothing between the monster and everyone it loves. Your father didn't have me." Serene's voice cut through the dark like a blade. Clear, certain, steady enough to surprise even herself. The wolf went still. "Your father didn't have an anchor," she continued, her heart pounding so hard it shook her entire body. "He didn't have someone whose wolf could meet his and hold it steady. He fought alone, and he fell alone. And that is a tragedy, Theron. But it is not a prophecy." She reached for the nearest chain. The iron was freezing against her palms, so cold it burned. And the moment she touched it, she felt resistance. Not from the wolf, from him. From the part of Theron that was still convinced the chains were necessary. That letting go meant becoming the monster. "I know what it feels like," Seren said, tears streaming down her face, her fingers locked around the chain. "To believe you're only worth what you can contain. To believe that if you stop performing, stop sacrificing, stop shrinking yourself down to something manageable, then the people around you will see what's really underneath, and they'll leave." The wolf's breathing slowed. "My parents left me on castle steps when I was 3 days old," she continued, "and I spent my entire life after that trying to be small enough, quiet enough, useful enough that no one would throw me away again. I turned myself into a tool because tools get kept, Theron. Tools have purpose. And I was so terrified of being purposeless that I let myself disappear." Her voice broke. She gripped the chain harder. "But I'm not a tool, and you're not a monster. And this." She pulled at the chain, felt it resist, pulled harder. "This is not protecting anyone. It's just a slower way of dying." The chain shattered. The sound was enormous, a crack that split the dark like lightning, and the wolf lurched forward as the pressure released. Seren scrambled back, adrenaline flooding her veins, expecting the worst. The wolf didn't attack. It stood, trembling, its legs unsteady from months of being bound. The places where the chains had bitten into its body were still raw, still bleeding, but the blackened rot was fading. Slowly, painfully, healthy fur crept back over the wounds. Seren reached for the next chain. This one broke easier, then the next, then the next. With each chain that fell, the wolf grew steadier. Its breathing deepened. The wild, desperate gold of its eyes began to soften, not to gray, but to something warmer, richer, a gold that burned like autumn sunlight instead of fever. The last chain held the wolf's jaw shut. Seren knelt in front of the creature, their eyes level, and placed both hands on the cold iron. "You're allowed to speak," she whispered. "You're allowed to want things. You're allowed to love her and the child without destroying them. That is not what your blood means." She broke the final chain. The wolf opened its jaw and breathed. Not a snarl, not a howl. A breath, deep and full and free. And the sound of it moved through the bond and into Seren's chest and settled there like a heartbeat finding its rhythm. Then the wolf moved forward and pressed its massive head against her stomach. Gentle, deliberate, reverent. Serene buried her hands in the thick fur of its neck and felt the bond flare so bright it turned the dark forest to gold. The dead trees shuddered. Bark split and green burst through, tiny leaves unfurling from branches that hadn't held life in years. The too warm ground cooled. The oppressive silence filled with sound, wind through new leaves, birdsong distant but real, the steady pulse of something alive and growing. The wolf dissolved beneath her hands, not violently, gently, like mist burning off in morning light. And in its place, Theron was kneeling before her. Human, whole. His forehead pressed against her stomach, his hands gripping the fabric of her nightgown, his shoulders shaking with sobs he'd held back for over a decade. "I killed my father," he said, the words breaking apart in his throat. "And I thought I deserved to become him." "You didn't," Seren whispered, cradling his head. "You don't. I was so afraid of hurting you that I hurt you worse." "I know. I wasted 11 months. We have the rest of our lives." He looked up at her. His eyes were gray, clear, steady, unclouded gray, and behind them, through the bond, Seren could feel his wolf, calm and present and anchored. Not chained, not suppressed. Simply at peace. "I love you," he said, and the words sounded like they'd been trapped in his chest for months, pressing against his ribs, waiting for the cage to open. "I loved you when you showed up with one trunk and a look on your face like you were ready to fight every person in the room. I loved you when you tore up my garden and replanted it with herbs you talked to by name. I loved you when you brought me tea I couldn't open the door to accept. I loved you, and I will never forgive myself for making you believe otherwise." Seren pulled him up and kissed him. Tasted salt. Tasted grief and relief, and the raw, unmistakable flavor of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. They woke together in his ruined chambers, tangled in each other, the bond between them humming low and warm and golden. The morning light came through the cracked window and fell across his face, and for the first time since she'd known him, Theron Valdris looked young. The hollows beneath his eyes had softened. The rigid set of his jaw had eased. He was still holding her, one arm around her waist, one hand splayed across her stomach, and in sleep, his thumb moved in slow, absent circles over the place where their child was growing. Seren watched him breathe and felt something vast and quiet settle in her chest. Not just love, something bigger than that. The bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she'd been traded or arranged or placed here by someone else's design, but because she had chosen it, chosen him, fought for him, torn down his walls and her own, and found that what was underneath was worth every scar. She closed her eyes and pressed her forehead against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear. Outside, the first birds were singing. The curse didn't vanish the night Seren broke the chains. Theron still woke sometimes in the dark, his breathing sharp, his hand reaching for her before his eyes were fully open. Old wounds didn't close overnight. The guilt didn't dissolve simply because he'd chosen to set it down. Some mornings he was quiet in a way that told her the dreams had found him again. Not the dark forest, not the chains, but the memory of his father's eyes going empty. The memory of the blade. Those things would always live in him, But Seren was there. Every time he reached, she was there. And slowly, night by night, his hand stopped reaching in panic and started reaching in peace. Just to feel her. Just to know. She learned the rhythm of his healing the way she'd learned the rhythm of herbs and seasons, with patience and attention, and the understanding that some things cannot be rushed. There were setbacks. There were nights when the gold flickered in his eyes, and she held him until it passed. There were mornings when he couldn't speak, when the weight of memory pressed down so heavily that all she could do was sit beside him in the quiet and let him know he wasn't carrying it alone. But there were good days too, more and more of them. Days when he laughed so freely it startled the courtiers. Days when he found her in the herb garden and knelt beside her in the dirt without saying a word, just working alongside her, their shoulders touching. Days when he pressed his hand against her growing belly and his eyes stayed gray, warm and clear, and full of something that looked like wonder instead of fear. The court's reaction was precisely what she'd expected. A foundling herbalist from a borderland pack no one had heard of, bonded to the Alpha King and carrying his heir. The whispers followed her through every corridor and every formal dinner. She heard them in the rustle of silk and the careful silences that fell when she entered a room. Theron heard them too. If anyone in this court has something to say about my mate," he announced at the first council session after their bonding, his voice carrying the full weight of a king who had survived a war, a curse, and his own stubbornness. "They are welcome to say it directly. To me. Loudly. So that I can hear it clearly before I respond." No one said anything. The whispers became quieter after that. Drystan, in his measured way, simply adjusted. He began consulting Seren on matters related to the borderlands, drawing on her knowledge of the Grey March territories with the same efficiency he brought to everything. If he found it unusual to brief a former herbalist on border patrol rotations, he never showed it. Irina wept the day the baby kicked for the first time. She tried to hide it, turning away to busy herself with a tincture that didn't need adjusting, but Seren saw and understood. The healer had carried the weight of Queen Iselda's dying wish for over a decade, watching, waiting, hoping she hadn't made a terrible mistake. The kick was proof she hadn't. The baby arrived on a morning in late spring, loud and furious and perfect. Theron held his child with hands that didn't tremble. His eyes were gray, clear and steady and bright with tears that fell without shame. Seren watched him cradle their daughter against his chest, watched his lips move against the crown of the baby's head, whispering words too soft for anyone else to hear. Irina examined the child thoroughly, twice, then a third time, just to be certain. "Healthy," she declared. "Strong wolf, stable, no trace of degeneration." The sound Theron made was not a word. It was something deeper than language, a release that came from a place he'd kept locked for so long that opening it shook his entire body. He pulled Seren against him, their daughter nestled between them, and buried his face in her hair. Months later, Seren woke in the pale gray light of early morning. Theron was still asleep beside her, their daughter curled against his chest in the space between them, her tiny hand wrapped around his finger. His face was peaceful. His breathing was deep and even. No nightmares, no chains, no gold flickering behind closed eyelids. Seren watched them for a long moment, warmth blooming in her chest so vast it felt like it might overflow. Then she settled back against his shoulder, closed her eyes, and let the morning hold them.